welcome to this episode of Higher Education Matters podcast. My name's James Hazard. I'm Director of Learning and Teaching and Deputy Head of the School of Education and Childhood. And I'm being joined by Dr. Michael Whelan.
Hi, I'm Michael Whelan. I'm Senior Lecturer in Education here at the School of Education and Childhood. And my research focuses on young people generally, but also with a particular focus on youth violence and serious youth violence.
I had the privilege of attending one of your recent research talks, proved to be incredibly impactful and moving for myself and I think everybody else that was in the audience. And since then, I've been really keen on getting you in here to have a discussion for an episode on higher education matters. Your research is quite complex that you're going to go into, but I suppose as you summed it up, it's kind of related to youth violence, youth wellness, and kind of branches off in different areas with regards to the research that you're doing. And naturally, as someone who's worked in education for over 20 years now, working with young people and being a father as well, this really resonated with me, and I think that the content is really going to be interesting for our viewers. So kind of going straight into our questions then, Michael, are you able to give us an overview of, I suppose, how you got involved in this in the first place and the kind of journey to date, the kind of areas that you're engaging with?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably useful to, without going all the way back to childhood, just to go back a little bit in that, so I work on a couple of the programs here at UE, and I'm not a teacher by background. So sometimes when you say I'm in the School of Education, people think, okay, they have worked in schools previously. So my background is in youth work. I qualified in youth work in Ireland back in some time ago. I worked in Ireland, in Australia, and in London mainly. So in working a little bit with homeless young people, working in disadvantaged communities in London and in Ireland. I suppose it's some of those experiences across that time that drew me into my time in academia, which is an interest in violence and encounters and experiences of violence. And I think the thing in particular maybe that led me to this is that over that time, in particular working in London, we had a period in the late 2000s where there was a very strong focus on serious youth violence. And I had friends who were outside that context, so who had nothing to do with youth work, and they would say to me, well, you must know what this is about, you must know what's going on. And the reality was that I knew my own little bubble, but actually I couldn't see the wood for the trees. And that was the thing that drove me to get into research, to undertake a PhD. So my PhD focused on street violence amongst young men in London. And it was really about trying to understand the broader picture, trying to understand some of the drivers that sit behind violence, some of the things that aren't captured in the headline news stories about this, trying to understand the nuance. And yeah, I mean, we can come on to it, but perhaps one of the depressing things is that some of those challenges still persist today in terms of perhaps the oversimplification of experiences of violence. But I mean, just to fill in a little bit, so that PhD brought me into academia, and since then I suppose I write a bit about young people, and I mean I talk about kind of young people's well-being because I think that young people's well-being is impacted by violence, by an experience of violence, but also challenges in relation to well-being can bring people to violence too. So they're interrelated, and often people think about violence in isolation, but typically when you explore experiences of violence in more depth, it sits amongst a much broader range of well-being issues in young people's lives.
It began then, obviously, your background in youth and youth work, etc., and then the violence came into it from the kind of social construct that was around at the time and the environment you were in. That sort of pushed you in that direction.
Yeah, I suppose I had experiences as a youth worker of violence, and maybe reflecting back now, some of that became a little bit normalised. I think that that's perhaps not uncommon. So I had experiences of staff members being shot, of knife-related incidents, young people being injured, and yeah, I think some of that perhaps, and I don't just speak for myself. I think when you work in that world, perhaps you find ways of kind of normalizing the fact that these things go on in your life and in the lives of the young people that you work with. Yeah, I think that's a challenge in itself from a professional point of view, actually, not to become passive about some of those experiences. But yeah, so it was those things and wanting to understand them and seeing the ways in which they were shaping and impacting people's lives that kind of pushed me to want to understand them better and, to use a corny line, make a difference in relation to those things. Yeah.
So where's the journey taking you then? What's been the sort of I suppose highlights and the sort of big things that you've unpacked since being involved in it?
Yeah, I can't say that there are these kind of single moments of change. I think it's about an ongoing effort, an ongoing challenge, and I think one of the things that maybe is a difficulty maybe in relation to research around something like violence is that sometimes we try to frame research, I think, or maybe research does get framed in the way in which we think about kind of scientific breakthroughs around, around an illness, for example. So we think about, the cure to cancer or the cure to COVID or whatever it happens to be. And sometimes I think we look for the cure to violence. And so I suppose maybe the reality, as I perceive it at least, is that, there is no cure for violence, unfortunately, will always be a part of our society. And so our challenge as researchers is to understand the way in which it is continually kind of manifesting itself and the way in which, in particular from my point of view, young people are experiencing it. But certainly I think what I would observe is the last, maybe for me, the last 5 to 10 years, I've been fortunate enough to come together with a group of people who are passionate in their in their drive to understand particular aspects of violence and how it manifests in young people's lives. And so, yeah, that's been a real driver for me. I think the opportunity to, for example, to write about it in relation to something we'll talk about, masculinities and how young people experience violence in public space and how that relates to performances of masculinities. I think, one more recent piece which I've really kind of wanted to do, going right back to my PhD, was to understand the role of youth workers working in A&E wards. And I recently had an opportunity to undertake that research. And for me, that's really valuable in terms of understanding those practice interventions, what's effective about them, how we can make them more effective, how we can kind of learn from them and adapt. And, some of the conversations that have stemmed around that have been valuable in the UK context, but also internationally. So thinking about, what is impactful? How do we target that kind of work when we put a youth worker into an A&E ward? So just to give a little bit of context, so there are projects around the UK called A&E Navigators, and what they do is they employ typically staff from a youth work background. They are based in accident and emergency wards. And the principle, at least, is when a young person comes in with a serious youth violence related incident, that they're there in situ at that kind of key point. They would talk about it as a kind of a teachable or a reachable moment. And so, yeah, to have the opportunity to be able to research that, to understand actually, if we talk about this reachable or teachable moment, what is that? What's kind of effective about that? Or actually, what are some of the limitations or the challenges in terms of implementing a program like that effectively?
Okay, fantastic. So really interesting stuff. So before we move on to the second question, one sort of final point, I suppose, on this, and I appreciate this is probably a really, really huge question. I guess we can't fully unpack it, but are you seeing impact in society in the UK at the moment? Are you seeing things, what direction do you see this going? Or has it been going?
I think there's some progress. I think maybe I see it as being, maybe there's kind of different elements in some respects working against each other at times. So there are very strong drives to, on the one hand, put more effective interventions in place. But on the other strand, there is, and I think this runs through lots of the challenges associated with different areas of violence intervention work. There is a very strong both fear and, I would say, at times dislike of young people within British society. Right. And that kind of creates this real tension in terms of achieving effective interventions. So, if I just harking back a little bit, there was a mantra that was used often in the kind of New Labour years, which still kind of threads through lots of policy and policing conversations, which is give them places to be so that they're off the streets. And I think it's an interesting kind of example to talk about, because I think it speaks to lots of that tension. So on the one hand, it is about, let's think about effective things that are supportive to young people, but at the same time, let's get them out of our sight. Let's get them,
okay.
And actually, if you think about challenges, even specifically in public space that we face, in relation to other sections of society, there's probably no other section of society, or very few at least, where we would say the solution to this is to get them off the street, and to have that as part of our kind of accepted common sense understanding of the nature of the problem and the people that we're trying to work with. So I think there is a real tension which remains in how we view young people's place in British society. And so, coming back to your original question, I think there are some important steps forward that have been made, and there are some really passionate and hardworking people seeking to understand the problem and to achieve effective interventions. But until we come to a clearer and more honest conversation about our perspective on young people in British society, and in particular in relation to public space, their place in public space, then I think we're essentially kind of working in tension with ourselves.
No, that's really illuminating, because as you're saying that, I'm sort of relating to everything you're saying. That is how we perceive things. There used to be, isn't it? There has to be a place for them to go, and almost perceived as a nuisance, I suppose, if that isn't put in place. Okay, so obviously our audience is aimed at sort of HE practitioners that are working with young people all the time. So how does your work involve working with professional practitioners, and how does it support, obviously, people that are working with young people?
Yeah, so it's been a really important strand of my work. I mean, dating back to when I first came into academia, my PhD supervisor used to say to me, as I was towards the end of my PhD trying to get it completed, used to say, look, if you want to get into academia, you really need to get this finished, to get this nailed. And in my head, even though I didn't say it to him at the time, I was thinking, well, I don't want to go into academia, because in a sense I didn't really understand at the time what it could offer, and I see that much more clearly now. And so I think that we have a great space, I think, for opening challenging, difficult, critical conversations. And so for me, that's one part of what we can do, I think, is, and one of the reasons that I write around pedagogies of discomfort. So around thinking about opening up challenging and difficult spaces for the kinds of conversations that ask us or prompt us to explore really difficult questions around violence, around any number of young people's, the aspects of their experiences, but also the difficulties of working around really gritty and challenging issues. So, one of the things that I will sometimes try and do from a teaching point of view with students is to really prompt them to think. So when we talk about kind of engaging with difficult or hard to reach young people, to use that kind of maybe problematic term, is that that's really difficult to do. And so when you work with somebody and they're swearing in your face, or they're being abusive, or being physically perhaps threatening to you, that in that moment to be able to think, okay, let me think empathetically about this person's situation and what's the driver for their behaviour. So I think, that's from a teaching point of view, but also from a research and from a writing point of view. I suppose a lot of what I'm trying to do is to think about, firstly, how do we open the spaces for those, but also how do we understand some of the issues that might be sitting behind these issues, so that we can kind of get to the underlying challenges.
Okay. So in the introduction, I spoke briefly around the staff development event when you were doing a research talk, and I sort of alluded to the fact it was very moving. Yourself was very emotional. I think the impact of that was sort of felt throughout the room, really, and you sort of spoke about some of the reflections you've had around that. Would you like to sort of explain a little bit more detail around what that meant to you and what your observations were from that?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, there's probably lots that I could reflect on and write about in relation to that. But I did think, in the context of this conversation, there are a couple of really valuable points. So just to give the context, so we had a school staff development day, and I was presenting what was to be, I don't know, like I think maybe a 5 to 10 minute update on research. So one of those things that you would normally kind of quite quickly rattle through, just give a quick update. And in the process of that, I was talking about this A&E navigator work, and I had quite an intensive period of collecting data and hearing people's stories about their experiences of violent incidents, of challenges of receiving the right kind of support in relation to that, and people talking passionately about, in that moment, seeing the young person first and foremost as a young person, a vulnerable victim of violence. And so in talking about this in the staff update, so, to put it plainly, I started to cry. I really became a bit overwhelmed by the emotion of it. I think maybe some of it was about when you do research and you're in the throes of it, these accounts are words on a page that you're unpicking and analysing like you would do. I mean, hopefully not like you would do a set of numbers, but, essentially you're busy working through this data. So I think there's something interesting about kind of how we look after ourselves through research, and how we give ourselves space to reflect on that. But I think the other piece that I think is really interesting to reflect on is around masculinities. So one of the things that in that moment, so I had this kind of tearful moment, if you like, in the midst of a staff meeting, and people were super supportive, and people were, very positive, both in the moment, but also in messages afterwards. And it struck me in reflecting on that that it reinforced a point. So I've talked to you about so there's a book that myself and a colleague wrote, Brian McShane, at De Montfort University, and we wrote a chapter in that around what we've called safe masculinities. And the point is not that not that young men experience safety in the way in which I did. I think the point that I would make is, in that moment, there was a safety in my ability to show vulnerability, to show a particular performance of masculinity, which, if you like, allowed me to cry, to show vulnerability, and actually that people were supportive of that. And exactly the point that we make in this chapter is that in order for young men to be safe in public space, and I don't apply this to all young men, but the young men that we observed in working class communities, was the need to perform strength, the need not to show vulnerability. So exactly the opposite of the experience that I had. And it reinforces the point that one of the points that we were trying to make in this chapter is, well, firstly, that performances of masculinity are shaped by the wider context. And it's really important for us, if we're to understand why so many young men become involved in violent incidents, to understand the nature of the context and how that shapes the kinds of performance of masculinity that are open to young men. And what we observed was that the least favourable performance or position that a young man could occupy was to acknowledge or to acknowledge vulnerability, or to be a victim.
Right.
Yeah. So that's not to say that people weren't victims, and that's kind of one of the interesting, observations. So I remember a young man in my research talking about how he was beaten up by some young people after being to a youth club. And he kind of gave this account, and he said afterwards, but it was okay because later me and my cousin, we went back and we sorted things. Right. Yeah. So there is the admission of vulnerability and of being a victim, but actually of shifting that through retribution. So using the resource of retribution. And of course, these are kind of, I explore these things as, if you like, linguistic constructions, if you like. So it is about the young man talking about himself as not a victim because he had retribution, but actually that requires an actual physical act of violence.
Right. So in the young person's world that we're discussing, then that vulnerability as a weakness and something that will be exploited in that environment by other young people. So it's so in the space where you were having that discussion, you felt able to express that, but in their world, to express that would be seen as a weakness.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the chapter we talk about this kind of, I suppose, double-sided coin of belonging and vulnerability. So on the one hand, young men, as any of us do, want to belong and want to find a sense of belonging in the spaces that they occupy. So whether that's the family home, the school, or in the context that we were observing, public space. And yet there was an inherent kind of vulnerability to that, and they were having to kind of navigate their way through that and to find belonging and connection. And often that meant presenting themselves in a way that was hard, that was strong, that put them in a certain level of kind of competition, perhaps with other young men, to kind of perform the right form of masculinity. Yeah. And I think the important point, again, to come back to that kind of contextual piece is that, you can observe these things and go, well, okay, that's how it is. But actually, the important thing from my point of view in terms of the kind of thinking about the social geography of public space is that this is a product of the spaces that we create, and that these things aren't written in stone. That we, if we think about kind of public spaces or any building or office or whatever, we construct these spaces. So we physically shape them, but actually they in turn shape us in terms of how we interact with each other, in terms of how we view ourselves or how we present ourselves in those spaces. And it's the same with public space. So I think we're challenged as a society, in particular in terms of urban public spaces, to think about how do we shape public spaces? In what ways, in very explicit ways and in less explicit ways, do we send messages about who belongs and who doesn't belong? And that's a bit about age, but it's also a bit about gender. It's also about race. So there's an intersectionality. It's about class. Yeah. So all of those different elements.
And do you think part of you mentioned one of the sort of mantras from the Labour Party? Do you think the idea of getting young people off the streets and into somewhere is to change that? I mean, albeit it may not be successful, but is it to change that kind of organic process of them developing their own culture where that's seen to be a weakness and they build their own perceptions of what masculinity is that, for example, youth clubs and things like that, is that to try and intervene and have some intervention to prevent that kind of culture from growing?
Well, I think there are different elements to it, and I think this is one of the things that I would emphasize, that there isn't any one single agenda saying, this is the only thing that we're trying to do. There isn't some grandmaster kind of manipulating all this. Yeah. It's actually a layering of lots of different perspectives, experiences. But I suppose the thing that's interesting and important from an analysis point of view and from a research point of view is like, what are the dominant threads running through this? And so without a doubt, there is some very valuable intent in terms of the provision of places for young people to go, for example. I think that there are some problematic elements in that as well. So, for example, if we look at the current context where lots of local authority youth provision has been eroded, and we find lots of really amazing voluntary sector organisations running youth clubs, running youth provision, but the challenge often that those organisations face is that they have to construct a particular kind of articulation of young people in order to keep generating money, or in order to keep justifying why they're doing what they're doing. So I think that some of the context we find ourselves in right now, and that kind of short-termism in terms of funding, sometimes brings organisations that are doing that youth work, and I'm not, I need to be really clear, I'm not in any way trying to undermine people's intent, but actually it's about the context of the provision that often lends themselves perhaps to kind of buying into helpful narratives about young people. Right. But I think the other point that I want to make about the kind of public space piece is that there's a kind of a duality to this, and if you like, the value of directing young people to public or to youth provision is that it enables politicians in particular to avoid a difficult conversation around young people's entitlement to a space in public place. Yeah, so I think that it is inherently unpopular for politicians. So actually a good example, we're just about 20 years on from David Cameron's famous kind of hug a hoodie headlines. I don't know if you recall that. This is going back to mid-2000s, and David Cameron had just come into leadership of the Conservative Party at the time, and he was advocating a kind of a shift in how we view young people, and the whole agenda became kind of dubbed hug a hoodie. Right. Yeah, and he got absolutely slated and quite quickly moved away from that perspective. So there is a challenge for politicians in being able to kind of front up to the question of, how do we deal with young people in public space in a way that is inclusive, in a way that is democratic, in a way that recognises young people's entitlement to public space, or even if you don't accept all those things, the fact that recognising that young people will use public space regardless of what you provide outside of that, and therefore they should be able to do that safely, to be safe and to feel safe.
Right. Okay, so where's your research going then? What do you see the next steps for you? I know you briefly touched upon A&E, but you've mentioned before you're sort of involved in many strands of this. Sort of where's it taking you?
Yeah, well, a piece that I'm just starting, and probably a frustration that it's taken me this long to be able to do it, but I'm looking at a piece around. So just starting with a colleague called Harry Fisher at University of Bristol, a piece looking at young people's safety in public space. So it's what's called a photo voice methodology. So we're working with young people in Bristol and young people in a site in Islington in London. And so we're going to work with them over a period of time, and we're going to do some workshops with them. We'll have some peer researchers. And essentially what we wanted them to do is to go out and about in public space, to take pictures of the spaces that they use and that they occupy, and to use those pictures to tell a story about their experiences of safety in public space. And so, so I suppose, coming back to your question, it is about that opportunity to really foreground young people's safety in public space, and going right back to the start of our conversation, that's one of the depressing things maybe that actually in all this time since my PhD, and I'm going back whatever it is, 12 years longer maybe, that actually there isn't a huge amount of research that tries to foreground young people's experiences and to genuinely understand what things would help make public space safer for young people. So that's a really nice piece that I'm just starting, so I think public space will remain a really important thread, and obviously youth violence. But I think there are always new and challenging issues coming up. So I think the online environment is also interesting and challenging space in terms of thinking about, so I've been quite preoccupied, I suppose, with public physical space, but actually there are a whole variety of spaces that young people occupy, and I think we're also challenged to think about those kind of digital environments, and to think about, if we look at something like, to come back to that previous discussion around the kind of performance of masculinity in urban public spaces, well, what can we say about the performance of masculinity in online environments? Right. What's the structuring of those spaces? What are the power dynamics and the relations within those spaces? Who are the power brokers, and what does that mean for experiences of things like, gender identity, but also thinking about things like experiences of violence and of social injustices in those online environments? Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting area of discussion. I was recently reading a book, I think it was by Jonathan Haidt, who was talking about, I suppose, the shift in kind of youth and the upbringing of youth over the last sort of 30 years, sort of pre-2000, how the kind of freedom of children to be more exploratory, more more adventurous, to be able to engage in developing more social skills outdoors, and the kind of overtaking of the digital environment that sort of crept up on everybody and automated itself in our lives, and how there's no real understanding of what that space looks like. You know, what is very early, isn't it? And now you know, we're very concerned around our children walking 30 metres towards a park because we worry about dangers of society, but at the same time we allow them exposure to the digital world where we're still very unaware of sort of the dangers that lurk there. So that's something that's actually being looked at now, is it? The kind of that digital space within your field of research?
Yeah, I think that there is. I think it's slow. I think one of the challenges in terms of research with young people is that often there are difficulties in terms of accessing the resource needed to do really substantial and meaningful research in that area. But certainly there is ongoing research. I think one of the challenges is trying to to keep up with the pace of change. So you start a research project and literally by the end of it, the whole context of the online environment kind of shifted so much. But there's certainly some research, but I think in particular in relation to AI, I mean a current kind of idea that there was I was talking to some young people recently, and they were looking at a piece on their phone, and quite quickly somebody looked at it and kind of said, "Oh, that's so AI."
Right.
And I thought it was such an interesting comment. It's such a simple comment, but the point was that we kind of think that young people or often we kind of maybe assume simplistic understandings of or engagement with content or online environments and spaces. And actually young people are making decisions about, for example, the kind of realness or otherwise of content that they're engaging with. Now, we might not agree with their assessments, but I think our challenge is to understand on what basis are they making those judgments. So I think that there's certainly work ongoing, but there's more work yet to be done, and it's changing.
Okay, so sort of final question then, something we're wanting to sort of introduce to engage our audience really with kind of to reflect upon the session and to sort of take their thinking a little bit further. So what's the one thing you think our audience need to be thinking about and need to be reflecting on and should be taking from our conversation here? What should they be, what are the next steps if they were really interested in this and they want to sort of reflect deeply? What should they focus on?
Yeah, well, you've asked for one thing, and I'll give you two.
Fair enough.
So I want you to have value for money, but I think one simple thing is actually to figure out how, which is a very simplistic thing, but like, how do we like young people more, and how do we have a more honest conversation about our relationship with young people in Britain today? And I think the other maybe more complex piece in relation to youth violence is about recognising that, as I mentioned earlier, there is no simple solution to youth violence. So actually our challenge is to understand the issue and all of its complexities. So I think if I was to prompt people, what I hope they really take away from this conversation, it is about recognising that kind of complexity. And so, to give an example, the line between what it is to be a perpetrator of violence and to be a victim of violence is not as simplified as we often like to make it out to be. So somebody might be a victim today and a perpetrator next week, or vice versa. So actually those two things are often very interwoven. So there's something for us in the challenge of understanding the complexity of violence in young people's lives. So when we find ourselves drawn to those more simplistic solutions or articulations of the problem, to be able to kind of draw away and to try and think, what are those kind of, what are the complexities that sit behind that, and how might we try and unpack those, and recognizing that we will never find a single solution that addresses the entirety of the problem. So it's about trying to think, what's the aspect of this problem that I really want to make a meaningful change in relation to.
Okay, and just very quickly to elaborate on your first point, us liking young people slightly more as a society, as a nation, and I think you sort of touched on the kind of portrayal in the media, how we as a country portray youth in what we read and almost perceive them as a threat or a nuisance, and just taking a step back and thinking critically about that portrayal and us sort of looking past that, I suppose, and being a little bit more open-minded and supportive.
Yeah, and like I think and I think this is a challenge at a for example, at an academic level, but also in our everyday lives. And I feel this myself. So I've got 2 teenage sons, and I think there is a challenge for us in that moment where we're tempted to go, "Oh, teenagers," and people use that line all the time, and it's so dismissive, and it's so kind of lacking in acknowledgement of the complexity of what it is to be a young person growing up in the world today. And the things that are challenging for young people today won't be the things that were challenging 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but it doesn't mean that they are any less real for young people. And that's our challenge, I think.
I think that line will probably resonate with most parents, actually. It did with me then, that whenever you sort of having a grumble to your friends or your parents about something my son's doing, it's okay, well, he's a teenager, he's going to do that. That is the go-to, isn't it? That's sort of like, it's sort of the universal criticism for everything is they're a teenager, that's what they're going to do, sort of thing. Fantastic. Well, really thanks a lot. I really appreciated that. I think, the audience will find that really interesting discussion. And if you'd like to engage further with Michael's research, we're going to put a link to a chapter in the description, which is Safe Masculinities, the Performance of Young Masculinities into Public Spaces. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you'll be able to do a bit of further reading. And thanks for watching.